The autumn wind swept across the rolling hills of Montana, carrying with it the scent of pine and the promise of an early winter. In the small town of Millfield, nestled between towering peaks and endless valleys, the Henderson family had learned to live with an emptiness that 10 years couldn't heal. David Henderson had been just 17 when he vanished without a trace during what should have been a routine camping trip with his high school friends. The search parties had combed every inch of the wilderness for months, but the mountains had swallowed him whole, leaving behind only questions and a grief that settled into the bones of everyone who knew him. Before we continue with this incredible story that shocked the entire nation, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love connecting with our viewers from around the world. Your support helps us bring you more amazing true stories like this one. Margaret Henderson stood at her kitchen window, the same window where she'd watched for her son's return every morning for a decade. The glass was fogged with her breath as she pressed her face against the cool surface, watching the mail truck disappear down Maple Street. Her husband, Robert, had already left for his job at the lumber mill. The same routine they'd followed since David's disappearance had shattered their world. The other children, twins Michael and Rebecca, were now in their 20s, living their own lives in distant cities. They'd learned to mention David carefully, as if speaking his name too loudly might break their mother completely. The investigation had been thorough, led by Detective James Patterson, a weathered man who'd seen too many missing persons cases end badly. The initial search had involved over 200 volunteers, including park rangers, local hunters, and even specialized rescue dogs. They'd found David's backpack at the edge of Whitefish Creek, about 3 miles from the campsite, but nothing else. No signs of struggle, no blood, no indication of what might have happened to the promising young man who'd planned to study engineering at Montana State University. The backpack had been sitting there like a cruel joke, still containing his wallet, his phone, and the energy bars his mother had packed for the trip. Detective Patterson had spent countless sleepless nights poring over the evidence, interviewing David's friends repeatedly, searching for any detail that might have been overlooked. The camping trip had been meticulously planned. Tommy Brennan had brought topographical maps, Jake Sullivan had researched weather patterns, and Chris Novak had packed enough supplies for a week, even though they'd only planned to stay 3 days. These weren't careless teenagers, they were experienced outdoorsmen who knew the wilderness intimately. That made David's disappearance even more baffling. The boys had set up camp at Devil's Tooth Ridge, a popular spot among locals, despite its ominous name. The ridge offered spectacular views of the valley below and was known for its excellent fishing in the nearby streams. According to their statements to police, David had complained of a headache around 10 p.m. and said he was going to walk to the creek to get some fresh air and splash cold water on his face. It was a journey he'd made dozens of times before on previous camping trips. The creek was only a 10-minute walk from their campsite, following a well-worn trail that even children could navigate safely. When David didn't return after an hour, his friends had grown concerned. Tommy had grabbed a flashlight and headed down the trail first, calling David's name into the darkness. The others had followed, their voices echoing off the canyon walls as they searched every possible hiding spot. They'd found nothing, no signs of a fall, no evidence of an animal attack, no indication that David had ever reached the creek at all. It was as if he'd simply vanished into thin air somewhere along that familiar trail. The search had continued for 6 weeks, becoming one of the largest missing persons operations in Montana's history. Helicopters with thermal imaging equipment swept the area repeatedly, their rotors thundering over the peaks from dawn until dusk. Cave rescue teams rappelled into every crevice and underground passage they could find, exploring miles of underground tunnels that honeycombed the mountains. The local Native American community, led by Elder Joseph Blackhorse, had organized traditional tracking parties using methods passed down through generations. reading signs in the wilderness that escaped modern searchers. Margaret had been the driving force behind the extended search, refusing to accept that her son was gone. She'd organized volunteer groups, coordinated with media outlets, and personally walked thousands of miles through the wilderness calling David's name. She'd carried his photograph to every town within a 100-mile radius, posting flyers on every available surface and speaking with anyone who would listen. Her determination had inspired others, but it had also worried those who loved her, as they watched her consume herself with the impossible task of finding her missing child. Robert had approached the crisis differently, channeling his grief into practical action. He'd worked overtime at the lumber mill to pay for private investigators, search equipment, and the growing mountain of expenses that accompanied a prolonged missing persons case. He'd learned to read topographical maps, studied weather patterns, and educated himself about wilderness survival techniques. While Margaret searched with her heart, Robert searched with methodical precision, following every lead, no matter how unlikely it seemed. The case had attracted national attention, featured on several television shows about missing persons and unexplained disappearances. Psychics had contacted the family offering their services. Conspiracy theorists had developed elaborate explanations involving government cover-ups, and well-meaning strangers from across the country had sent tips, theories, and expressions of support. The media attention had been both a blessing and a curse, keeping David's case in the public eye, while also subjecting the grieving family to intense scrutiny and countless false leads. Detective Patterson had interviewed hundreds of people during the investigation, following up on dozens of alleged sightings that led nowhere. He'd explored every possibility: accidental death, suicide, foul play, and even the chance that David had run away voluntarily. But everything pointed to a tragic accident in unforgiving terrain, despite the fact that experienced searchers had found no evidence to support that theory. The wilderness was vast and dangerous, filled with hidden crevices, underground streams, and wildlife that could eliminate evidence quickly and completely. As months turned into years, the active search had gradually wound down, but the case had never been officially closed. Detective Patterson had maintained a detailed file, updating it with every new piece of information, every reported sighting, every theory that emerged. He'd retired 6 years after David's disappearance, but not before creating a comprehensive cold case record that filled 3 thick binders and included detailed maps marking every location that had been searched. Margaret had finally started seeing a grief counselor in year 5, learning to function despite the hole in her heart that never seemed to heal. Dr. Linda Morrison had worked with many families of missing persons, and she'd helped Margaret understand that healing didn't mean giving up hope. It meant learning to live with uncertainty while still maintaining love for her missing child. The therapy had been difficult, forcing Margaret to confront the possibility that she might never know what had happened to David, but it had also given her tools to rebuild her relationship with her surviving children and her husband. Robert had developed his own struggles during those dark years, turning to alcohol as a way to numb the pain that threatened to overwhelm him. His drinking had started gradually: a beer after work to help him sleep, then 2 beers, then something stronger. By year 3, he'd been consuming a bottle of whiskey every few days, stumbling through his responsibilities at work and at home like a man sleepwalking through his own life. It had taken 2 interventions organized by concerned friends and co-workers before he'd finally agreed to enter treatment. The twins had struggled with survivor's guilt and the impossible task of living up to a brother who would remain forever 17 in their parents' memories. Michael had thrown himself into his studies, graduating valedictorian and earning a full scholarship to the University of Washington. But his academic success had felt hollow, overshadowed by his parents' grief and his own sense that nothing he achieved could ever matter as much as finding his missing brother. Rebecca had responded differently, becoming rebellious and reckless, as if she could force her parents to notice her by creating crises that demanded their attention. Family dinners had become rare, then non-existent, as everyone found ways to avoid the empty chair at the kitchen table. Holidays had been the worst, with David's absence casting a shadow over every celebration. Christmas mornings had been particularly difficult. Margaret had continued buying presents for David, wrapping them carefully and placing them under the tree where they would remain unopened until she quietly donated them to charity after New Year's Day. The house had gradually filled with the silence of unspoken grief, each family member carrying their pain privately, rather than risking the emotional explosion that might come from acknowledging it openly. The 10th anniversary of David's disappearance had passed just 2 months earlier, marked by a small memorial service at the family's church. Margaret had visited the spot where David's backpack was found, leaving a bouquet of wildflowers and sitting quietly for hours among the aspens and pines that had witnessed her son's last known moments. She'd stopped hoping for answers long ago, instead learning to find peace in small moments and the knowledge that somewhere in those hills, her son was at rest. Robert had joined her that day, and they'd held hands for the first time in years, united in their shared loss and the long journey of healing that had brought them to a place of grudging acceptance. Now, on this ordinary Tuesday afternoon in October, Margaret was preparing for another quiet evening in the house that had become both sanctuary and prison. She'd made Robert's favorite pot roast, planning to surprise him when he came home from work with the smell of comfort food filling the kitchen. The house felt different lately, lighter somehow, as if the weight of grief was finally beginning to lift after pressing down on them for so long. She'd been talking about maybe getting a dog, something to fill the silence that had dominated their home and give them a reason to smile again. Robert had been cautiously supportive of the idea, seeing it as a sign that his wife was ready to embrace life again rather than simply enduring it. The doorbell rang at exactly 4:47 p.m., according to the antique grandfather clock in the hallway that had belonged to Robert's grandmother. Margaret wiped her hands on her apron and walked to the front door, expecting to see a delivery driver or perhaps one of the neighbors dropping by for a chat. The autumn sun was setting early behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the front porch and making it difficult to see clearly through the frosted glass panels that decorated the old wooden door. She turned the deadbolt with practiced ease and pulled open the heavy door, the same door she'd opened countless times over the past decade, hoping against hope for news of her missing son. Standing on her doorstep, taller than she remembered, and wearing clothes that didn't quite fit his lean frame, was a young man with familiar green eyes and the same crooked smile that had made her heart sing 27 years ago when she first held her newborn son. His hair was longer and darker than it had been in high school, and his face was weathered in a way that spoke of hard years and difficult experiences far from the comfortable suburban life he'd known as a teenager. But there was no mistaking those eyes, or the small scar above his left eyebrow from when he'd fallen off his bicycle at age 7 while learning to ride without training wheels. The afternoon seemed to freeze around them as Margaret's mind struggled to process what she was seeing. Her hand flew to her mouth, covering the gasp that escaped her lips as her brain fought to accept the impossible reality standing before her. She felt her knees begin to buckle, the strength leaving her legs as 10 years of carefully constructed acceptance crumbled in an instant. The young man stepped forward quickly, steadying her with gentle hands that she remembered holding when they were small and perfect, when her biggest worry had been scraped knees and homework assignments rather than unsolved disappearances and unending grief. "Mum," he said softly, his voice deeper than she remembered but unmistakably his, carrying the same slight hesitation he'd always had when he was nervous or uncertain. "I'm home." Margaret's scream echoed through the quiet neighborhood, a sound of pure shock and overwhelming joy that would be remembered by everyone who heard it for the rest of their lives. It was a sound that seemed to contain 10 years of grief, transforming into impossible hope in a single, earth-shattering moment. Mrs. Lou from next door would later tell reporters that she'd never heard anything like it, a sound that made her drop the dishes she'd been washing and run outside to see what catastrophe had occurred, only to witness what appeared to be a miracle unfolding on the Henderson family's front porch. Within minutes, the Hendersons' front yard was filled with neighbors, all drawn by the commotion, all witnesses to what seemed to defy every law of probability and common sense. Mrs. Patterson from across the street had called 911, thinking someone was being attacked. The Johnson family from 2 doors down had come running with their teenage daughters, expecting to find an emergency that required immediate help. Instead, they found Margaret Henderson collapsed in the arms of a young man who looked remarkably like the missing boy, whose face had stared out from faded posters around their neighborhood for a decade. Robert received the call at the lumber mill where he'd worked for nearly 30 years, rising through the ranks from general laborer to shift supervisor through determination and reliability. His foreman, Bill Kowalski, had taken the call personally and nearly hung up, thinking it was some kind of cruel prank. But the voice on the other end had been Margaret's neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, and she'd been crying too hard to be making anything up. Bill had found Robert operating the bandsaw in the back of the mill, and he'd delivered the message as gently as possible. "Robert, you need to go home right now. It's about David." The drive home usually took 20 minutes through the winding mountain roads that connected the industrial area to their residential neighborhood, but Robert made it in 12, his hands shaking so badly he could barely steer his pickup truck around the familiar curves. He'd run 3 red lights and taken corners at speeds that would have horrified his insurance company, driven by a desperate need to reach his home and discover whether the impossible message was real or just another cruel false alarm. He found his front lawn filled with people, police cars lining Maple Street with their red and blue lights flashing, and news vans already beginning to arrive as word of David's return spread through the small community like wildfire. The reunion inside the house was private, sacred in its intensity, witnessed only by the family members who had waited 10 years for this moment. Margaret couldn't stop touching her son's face, running her fingers over the familiar features that had been preserved in countless photographs, but had matured and changed in ways that spoke of experiences she couldn't imagine. Robert, usually reserved with his emotions and more comfortable expressing love through actions than words, broke down completely, holding the boy he'd mourned for a decade, while tears streamed down his weathered cheeks. They sat together on the living room couch, where David had done his homework throughout elementary and middle school, where they'd watched countless movies as a family during lazy Sunday afternoons, where Christmas mornings had unfolded in happier times, when their biggest concerns had been whether Santa had remembered to eat the cookies they'd left for him. The familiar furniture seemed to embrace David's return, as if the house itself was welcoming back a missing piece of its soul. David looked older than his 27 years should have suggested, his hands calloused and scarred in ways that spoke of manual labor and outdoor living. His body was lean and muscular, but not in the way of someone who worked out in a gym. This was the fitness that came from years of physical survival, of hauling water and chopping wood and hiking endless miles through difficult terrain. He spoke slowly and carefully, as if words were precious resources he'd learned to conserve during long periods of solitude. When Margaret asked where he'd been for 10 years, he looked down at his scarred hands and said simply, "Surviving." When Robert pressed for details about that night so long ago, David's expression grew distant, haunted by memories he wasn't yet ready to share with the people he loved most in the world. The police arrived within an hour, led by Detective Sarah Williams, a younger woman who'd inherited David's cold case file when Detective Patterson retired and had studied the disappearance extensively during her 6 years with the department. She was professional but gentle, understanding that this moment belonged to the family first and the investigation second. She arranged for David to be examined by a paramedic, confirming his identity through a distinctive birthmark on his shoulder and dental records that Robert provided from their family dentist. The confirmation was just a formality. There was no doubt in anyone's mind that this was truly David Henderson, returned from whatever wilderness had hidden him for a decade. As news of David's return spread beyond their immediate neighborhood, the media descended on Millfield like a plague of locusts drawn to an impossible story. By evening, satellite trucks lined every street in the area, their massive antennas reaching toward the sky like mechanical trees. Reporters knocked on doors throughout the town, seeking anyone with a connection to the Henderson family, anyone who remembered David from high school, anyone who could provide background information or personal anecdotes that might humanize the extraordinary story that was already being broadcast around the world. The story had everything that networks craved in the modern media landscape: a decade-long mystery that had captured national attention, a family's unwavering hope in the face of impossible odds, and an impossible homecoming that defied every expert's explanation of how missing persons cases typically resolve. Within hours, David Henderson's return was trending on social media, discussed on cable news programs, and being analyzed by criminologists and wilderness survival experts who struggled to explain how a 17-year-old boy could vanish completely for 10 years and then simply walk up to his family's front door as if no time had passed at all. Margaret called the twins immediately after the police had finished their initial interviews, her voice breaking as she tried to explain the impossible situation that had transformed their quiet Tuesday afternoon into the most significant day of their lives since David's original disappearance. Michael was working late at his engineering firm in Seattle when he received the call, and he initially thought his mother was having some kind of psychological breakdown brought on by the stress of the recent anniversary. It took several minutes of conversation before he began to believe that his older brother, the brother he'd mourned, the brother whose absence had shaped his entire adult life, was actually sitting in their childhood living room. Michael immediately cancelled all his meetings and began the long drive through the night, from Seattle to Millfield, his mind racing with questions and emotions he'd spent years learning to suppress. He'd built his adult identity around being the oldest surviving child, the one who needed to be strong for his parents, the one who carried the responsibility of family leadership that should have fallen to David. Now suddenly, that entire self-concept was being challenged by a phone call that changed everything he thought he knew about his family and his place in it. Rebecca was in Denver, working as a nurse at Presbyterian St. Joseph Hospital, when she received Margaret's tearful call during her break between shifts. Unlike Michael, she believed immediately. She'd always maintained a secret hope that David was alive somewhere, a faith that had sustained her through the darkest periods of her family's grief. She called in sick for her remaining shifts and caught the first available flight to Montana, her heart pounding with anticipation and fear as the small commuter plane carried her home to face a reunion she'd dreamed about but never quite believed would happen. The family spent their first evening together in 10 years, sharing a meal around the kitchen table that had sat empty of David's presence for so long. Margaret had quickly expanded her pot roast dinner to accommodate their returned son, adding extra vegetables and setting the table with the good china she'd packed away years earlier when celebrations had become too painful to bear. None of them could eat much. The emotional intensity of the reunion had left everyone's stomach in knots. But the symbolic importance of sharing food together, of having David back in his rightful place at their family table, was overwhelming. David ate slowly and gratefully, as if every bite was a precious gift he'd learned not to take for granted. He asked careful questions about relatives, about old friends from high school, about the changes in their small town that had occurred during his absence. But when they asked about his decade away, about where he'd been and how he'd survived and why he'd never contacted them, he would only say that he'd been learning to survive in the wilderness and that he'd never stopped thinking about home and family. His reluctance to provide details was frustrating but understandable. Whatever had happened to him during those missing years had clearly been traumatic, and he needed time to process his return before he could share the full story of his exile. Detective Williams returned the next morning with a team of specialists, including a forensic psychologist named Dr. Elena Vasquez and a medical examiner who needed to document David's physical condition for the official record. David's physical state told a story of years spent living rough in the wilderness, with evidence of multiple healed injuries, consistent with outdoor accidents and signs of chronic malnutrition that suggested periods when food had been scarce. His psychological state was more difficult to assess. He seemed remarkably composed for someone who'd been missing for a decade, but there were moments when he would stare into the distance, lost in thoughts and memories he couldn't or wouldn't share with the professionals trying to help him readjust to civilization. The preliminary investigation revealed that David had indeed been living in the Montana wilderness for the entire decade of his absence, moving constantly through a network of caves and abandoned structures scattered throughout the vast backcountry that stretched for hundreds of miles in every direction. He'd survived by hunting small game with improvised traps and weapons, fishing in remote streams where few humans ever ventured, and occasionally trading work for supplies at isolated ranches and hunting camps where his presence could be kept secret from authorities who might ask uncomfortable questions. He'd avoided all contact with modern civilization, living like a modern-day hermit in some of the most remote and challenging terrain in North America. His survival skills had been learned through trial and error, supplemented by knowledge he'd gained from books about wilderness survival and Native American techniques he'd observed during his years of solitary existence. He'd become expert at reading weather patterns, finding water sources, and identifying edible plants and medicinal herbs that grew wild in the mountains. But the question everyone wanted answered remained elusive. Why had he chosen to stay away for so long? Why hadn't he contacted his family, even anonymously, to let them know he was alive? Why had he chosen 10 years of isolation and hardship over the warmth and love and comfort of home? These questions would prove more difficult to answer than anyone anticipated, and David's eventual explanations would challenge everything his family thought they knew about that night on Devil's Tooth Ridge and the decade of grief that had followed his disappearance. The medical examinations conducted over the following days revealed something deeply troubling that began to explain David's long absence. He showed clear signs of severe psychological trauma, consistent with someone who'd experienced a significant shock or witnessed something deeply disturbing that had fundamentally altered his relationship with the world around him. Dr. Vasquez noted that his behavior patterns suggested he'd been living in a constant state of hypervigilance for years, always ready to flee or hide at the first sign of potential danger. This wasn't the behavior of someone who'd simply decided to live off the grid as some kind of adventure. This was someone who'd been running from something specific and terrifying for an entire decade. Under gentle questioning from Dr. Vasquez, David began to reveal fragments of his story, like pieces of a puzzle that had been scattered by trauma and years of enforced silence. On that night, 10 years ago, he hadn't gone to the creek alone, as his friends had reported. Someone had followed him into the darkness, someone who shouldn't have been in those remote woods, someone whose presence had transformed a routine camping trip into a nightmare that would define the rest of David's life. The details came slowly and painfully, like water squeezed from stone, as David struggled to find words for experiences that had been locked away in the deepest corners of his mind for a decade. He'd witnessed something that night, something that had filled him with such terror and certainty of danger that he'd chosen immediate exile over the risk of bringing that danger to his beloved family. The specifics remained unclear, protected by layers of trauma and a survival instinct that had kept him alive, but also kept him silent for 10 years. But it was becoming clear that David Henderson hadn't simply gotten lost in the wilderness. He'd fled into it, driven by knowledge that made return impossible until circumstances finally changed enough to make homecoming safe. The investigation took a much darker turn as David's statements led police to re-examine evidence from that night with fresh eyes and new possibilities. His 3 friends, Tommy Brennan, Jake Sullivan, and Chris Novak, were brought in for additional questioning, and their decade-old stories began to show inconsistencies that hadn't been apparent during the original investigation. Tommy Brennan, now a successful insurance agent with a wife and 2 children, became visibly nervous when asked to provide more specific details about their camping trip and the events leading up to David's disappearance. Jake Sullivan, who'd moved to California after graduation and built a career in computer programming, initially refused to cooperate with the new investigation, claiming through his lawyer that reopening the case was causing him significant emotional distress and interfering with his ability to work and care for his own family. Chris Novak, who'd remained in Montana and worked as a hunting guide, seemed the most forthcoming of the 3, but even his recollections contained details that didn't match the official statements he'd given 10 years earlier. As David slowly found his voice and began to trust the investigators who were trying to help him, a very different story began to emerge about that fateful night in the wilderness. He hadn't simply wandered off and gotten lost, as everyone had assumed for a decade. He hadn't fallen into a hidden crevice or been attacked by wildlife or suffered some other tragic accident that had claimed his life in an unfindable location. Instead, he'd seen something that wasn't meant to be seen, encountered people who were using the remote wilderness for activities that required absolute secrecy and couldn't tolerate witnesses who might someday talk to the wrong people. The backpack found by Whitefish Creek hadn't been dropped accidentally during a moment of confusion or panic, as investigators had theorized for years. It had been placed there deliberately, part of an elaborate misdirection that had fooled everyone, including experienced investigators like Detective Patterson, who'd spent months following false leads based on the assumption that David had died somewhere near where his belongings were discovered. The truth was far more complex and sinister than anyone had imagined, involving a criminal enterprise that had been operating in the Montana wilderness for over 15 years. David had stumbled upon a major drug smuggling operation that used the remote mountains as a transfer point for shipments moving from Canada to distribution networks throughout the western United States. The very isolation that made the area perfect for family camping trips and outdoor recreation also made it ideal for criminal activities that required locations far from law enforcement attention and civilian witnesses. The smugglers had established a sophisticated network of hidden supply caches, communication equipment, and transfer points scattered across hundreds of square miles of wilderness that most people never explored. On that October night 10 years ago, David had witnessed a violent confrontation between smugglers and what initially appeared to be law enforcement officers conducting some kind of raid or arrest operation. But as he watched from his hiding place among the rocks and shadows, calling on hunting skills his father had taught him to remain invisible and silent, he'd gradually realized that some of the officers were actually corrupt officials working with the smuggling ring rather than against it. He'd watched in horror as arguments escalated into violence, as partnerships dissolved into betrayal, as men he'd initially hoped might rescue him from a dangerous situation, instead revealed themselves to be part of the very criminal enterprise that had turned his innocent camping trip into a nightmare. He'd seen a man executed in cold blood, watched as others buried the body in a location carefully chosen to ensure it would never be found by casual hikers or official search parties. He'd listened to conversations about corrupt officials, about payoffs and protection, about a network of criminal activity that reached into law enforcement agencies and local government offices. Most terrifying of all, he'd heard his own name mentioned as the witnesses discussed what to do about the problem of the missing teenager who'd wandered into the wrong place at the wrong time. The smugglers had spotted David as he tried to flee back to the campsite where his friends waited, unaware that their fun weekend had become a matter of life and death. Rather than kill him immediately as they'd killed the man whose execution David had witnessed, their leader, a man David knew only as the Colonel, had made him a different kind of proposition, one that would define the next decade of his life. Leave immediately, never contact his family, never return to civilization, and everyone he loved would remain safe. Stay silent about what he'd witnessed, disappear completely, and his family would be allowed to live normal, happy lives. But if he ever told anyone what he'd seen, if he ever tried to return home or contact authorities, his parents and siblings would pay the ultimate price for his failure to keep their deadly secret. David had been 17 years old, terrified beyond anything he'd ever experienced, and completely alone in a situation that no teenager should ever face. The choice had seemed simple in its horrible clarity. His life and freedom in exchange for his family's safety, his silence in exchange for their survival. He'd been given 30 minutes to decide and 30 minutes to disappear, with the clear understanding that hesitation or resistance would result in immediate death for both him and everyone he loved. The Colonel had shown him photographs of his house, his parents, his siblings, making it clear that the criminal organization had the knowledge and resources to carry out their threats, no matter where the Henderson family tried to hide. He'd taken his backpack to the creek as instructed, leaving it there as evidence that something had happened to David Henderson, while creating no trail that investigators could follow back to the real truth. Then he disappeared into the wilderness, with nothing but the clothes on his back, the terrible knowledge of what he'd witnessed, and the crushing responsibility of keeping his family safe through his own exile and silence. For 10 long years, he'd carried that burden alone, choosing their safety over his own freedom, their happiness over his own return to the world he'd lost. For 10 years, David had lived like a ghost in his own homeland, moving constantly through terrain he knew better than almost anyone, never staying in one place long enough to be tracked or discovered by either law enforcement or the criminals who'd driven him into exile. He'd taught himself to hunt and fish with primitive tools, learned to read weather patterns that could mean the difference between life and death, discovered shelter in caves and abandoned structures scattered throughout the vast wilderness. He'd become expert at avoiding human contact while still gathering information about the outside world, listening to conversations at distant truck stops and hunting lodges, piecing together news and developments like a detective building a case from fragments of overheard conversation. He'd watched his hometown from distant ridges, using binoculars he'd traded work to obtain, catching glimpses of his family's daily routines, while never daring to get close enough to ease their pain or his own. He'd seen his mother hanging laundry in their backyard, had watched his father leave for work each morning, had observed his siblings growing up and moving away to build lives of their own. The knowledge that they were safe, that his sacrifice was protecting them, had been the only thing that made his isolation bearable during the darkest moments of his exile. The criminal enterprise had indeed thrived during David's absence, protected by the silence his disappearance guaranteed and the corruption that reached into multiple levels of law enforcement and local government. The smuggling operation had expanded over the years, moving larger quantities of drugs and involving more people, but always maintaining the strict security protocols that had kept them hidden for so long. They'd monitored the Henderson family carefully, ensuring that David's exile continued and that no one came too close to discovering the truth that had driven him away. But 3 months earlier, everything had begun to change in ways that would eventually make David's return possible. The colonel had been killed in a territorial dispute with a rival organization moving in from the east, and the smuggling operation had collapsed into chaos as former partners turned against each other, and law enforcement agencies began to close in on what remained of the network. David had learned of these developments through the same careful eavesdropping and information gathering that had kept him alive and informed during his years of exile, piecing together the collapse of the organization that had held his family hostage through his enforced silence. With the immediate threat gone and the criminal network in complete disarray, David had finally felt safe enough to consider the possibility that had sustained him through a decade of isolation, the chance to go home. But even then, he'd approached the decision cautiously, spending weeks watching his family's house and the surrounding area, ensuring that no surveillance remained, that no danger still threatened the people he'd protected through his sacrifice. Only when he was absolutely certain that his return wouldn't bring harm to those he loved had he finally found the courage to walk up to his childhood home and ring the doorbell that would announce his impossible homecoming. The federal investigation that followed David's return moved swiftly once authorities understood the scope of what they were dealing with. Detective Williams coordinated with DEA agents, FBI specialists, and federal prosecutors to investigate David's claims and build cases against the surviving members of the criminal organization that had stolen 10 years of his life. Within days of beginning their investigation, they'd uncovered evidence of the smuggling operation David had described, finding remote locations in the mountains that yielded buried caches of drugs and money, along with the remains of at least 3 people who'd been murdered to protect the organization's secrets and maintain its security. The corruption angle proved more challenging to pursue, as many of the officials David had implicated were now retired, dead, or protected by statutes of limitations that made prosecution difficult. But the federal investigation was thorough and relentless, following paper trails and financial records that eventually led to indictments and arrests that would continue for months, as the full scope of the criminal enterprise became clear. David's testimony proved crucial in understanding how the organization had operated and identifying the surviving members who could still be prosecuted for their crimes. The media attention surrounding David's return intensified as details of his incredible story began to emerge through official channels and unofficial leaks. He became a reluctant celebrity overnight, the subject of countless articles and television interviews that portrayed him as everything from a wilderness survival expert to a tragic victim of circumstances beyond his control. Publishers offered him lucrative book deals. Hollywood producers expressed serious interest in acquiring the rights to his story, and speaking bureaus approached him about sharing his experiences with audiences around the world. But David remained focused on the much more difficult task of rebuilding his relationship with his family and adjusting to a world that had changed dramatically during his decade of absence. Technology that had been in its infancy when he disappeared, smartphones, social media, GPS navigation, wireless internet, was now ubiquitous and essential to daily life. The simple task of operating a modern television remote control or understanding how to use a credit card reader at a grocery store required patience and practice for someone who'd been living in the wilderness since before these innovations became commonplace. Margaret struggled with conflicting emotions that tore at her heart every day as she tried to process David's return. Overwhelming joy at having her son back was mixed with anger at the lost decade and the unnecessary pain her family had endured, guilt over the times she'd given up hope, and confusion about how to relate to the man her teenage son had become during his years of exile. She found herself studying his face during quiet moments, searching for traces of the boy she'd lost, while trying to understand the experiences that had shaped him into the careful, watchful man who'd returned to them. Robert found it even more difficult to accept that David had chosen to stay away, even understanding the impossible situation his son had faced and the threats that had made his exile necessary for the family's safety. The rational part of his mind understood that David had made the only choice available to protect those he loved, but the emotional part of his heart struggled with feelings of abandonment and the knowledge that his son had been suffering alone while his family had been grieving his loss. The reunion he'd dreamed of for 10 years was more complicated and painful than he'd ever imagined it could be. The twins worked hard to include their returned brother in their adult lives, but the age gaps and lost years created challenges that none of them had anticipated or prepared for. Michael was now older than David had been when he disappeared, and he struggled with suddenly no longer being the oldest child while trying to build a relationship with a brother who was more stranger than sibling after so many years apart. Rebecca found it easier to connect with David, perhaps because her work as a nurse had given her experience helping people cope with trauma and readjust to normal life after difficult experiences. David himself faced the monumental task of rejoining civilization after a decade in the wilderness, dealing with challenges that ranged from the practical to the psychological. Simple things like sleeping indoors, eating processed food, and dealing with crowds of people proved overwhelming at first, triggering anxiety and claustrophobia that required patience and understanding from everyone around him. He enrolled in intensive therapy with Dr. Vasquez, working through the trauma and guilt that had defined his adult life while learning coping strategies that would help him build a new identity as someone who was finally free to live openly again. The legal proceedings continued for months, eventually resulting in dozens of arrests and the seizure of millions of dollars in assets connected to the smuggling operation that had destroyed David's youth and stolen 10 years from his family. His testimony proved crucial in dismantling what remained of the criminal network and exposing the corruption that had protected it for so long. Justice came slowly and imperfectly, as it often does in cases involving complex criminal enterprises and official corruption, but it came nonetheless, providing some measure of closure for the suffering David and his family had endured. As the media attention gradually faded and the investigators moved on to other cases, the Henderson family began the quiet, patient work of healing and rebuilding relationships that had been fractured by trauma and loss. David enrolled in community college courses, determined to complete the education that had been interrupted so tragically during his senior year of high school. He struggled with modern technology and social changes that had occurred during his absence, but he adapted with the same determination and resourcefulness that had kept him alive in the wilderness for 10 years. Margaret returned to her morning ritual of standing at the kitchen window, but now she looked out with contentment and gratitude rather than the desperate hope that had sustained her through the darkest years of her life. The mountains that had hidden her son for so long no longer seemed threatening and mysterious. They were simply part of the landscape of home, beautiful and wild, but no longer holding the secrets that had tormented her for a decade. Robert reduced his hours at the lumber mill to spend more time with his returned son, teaching him about the changes in their small town and helping him navigate the complexities of modern life with patience and understanding. The twins visited more frequently than they had in years, bringing their own children to meet the uncle who'd become a legend in family stories and helping to rebuild the connections that had been strained by years of grief and geographical distance. Family dinners became regular events again, with David slowly learning to relax and enjoy the simple pleasure of sharing meals with people who loved him unconditionally. The empty chair at the kitchen table was finally occupied again, but the family had learned not to take such simple blessings for granted. On warm evenings, when the Montana sky painted itself in shades of gold and purple above the peaks that surrounded their valley, the family would sit together on the front porch, where David had first appeared like an answer to a decade of prayers. They would watch the same mountains that had hidden him for so long, no longer seeing them as a place of loss and mystery, but as the landscape that had shaped their son's character and taught him lessons about survival, determination, and the strength that comes from protecting those you love, no matter the personal cost. David never returned to camping or hiking in those mountains. The wilderness held too many painful memories and associations for him to find peace there. But he'd found a different kind of peace in his return to family and civilization. The doorbell that had announced his impossible homecoming became a symbol of second chances and the enduring power of family love, proof that even the most hopeless situations can sometimes resolve in ways that restore faith in the possibility of miracles. In a world full of missing persons cases that end in tragedy and families that never find answers to their questions, David Henderson's story stood as proof that sometimes, against all odds and expectations, the lost do find their way home. The small town of Millfield returned to its quiet rhythms and peaceful routines, but it was forever changed by the miracle that had occurred on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon when hope became reality and prayers were answered in the most unexpected way. David's story became part of local legend, told and retold in coffee shops and church gatherings, at school board meetings and family dinners, a reminder that even in the darkest circumstances and most hopeless situations, faith and love should never be completely abandoned because miracles, while rare, do sometimes happen when they're needed most. Years later, when journalists and authors would approach David asking what had finally given him the courage to come home after so many years of exile and sacrifice, he would smile with the quiet wisdom of someone who'd learned hard lessons about survival and love, and say simply, "I realized that the greatest risk wasn't in returning home. It was in staying away forever and never giving my family the chance to be whole again." The mountains had taught him everything about physical survival, but it was love for his family and from his family that had taught him the most important lessons about what it truly means to be alive and free.